You will not be able to have energy transition without a material long-term increase in primary mining.
I think it's undeniable that we also need nuclear in order to decarbonize.
We're seeing various, particularly perhaps in the Australian context, a huge amount of momentum around hydrogen. There's every state and territory either has or is developing a hydrogen strategy.
Good morning, everyone, and I want to welcome everyone to another live webinar for the One-to-One Mining Investment APAC online event. Today, to speak on the energy transition, commodities and the energy transition, we have Richard Day, Director of Strategy, Policy and Communications for the Department of Energy and Mining, South Australia. We have Rodrigo Echeverry, Head of Commodities Research at Noble Group, and Bert Koth, Managing Director and Partner at Denham Capital. So thanks to all of our panelists for taking part today. Just a reminder to the audience, we are going to be taking questions from you all today. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box rather than the chat. It's a bit easier for us to take them once they're in the Q&A box. And with that, I guess we can get started. So to kick things off, I actually wanted to have Richard give a little bit of an intro to his work that he's done with the government of South Australia in terms of decarbonization, and then we can kind of continue the conversation from there.
Thank you very much, Amy, and pleasure to be here. I guess I've got the honour of kicking things off. I heard an interesting statistic last week that 68% of global GDP and 55% of global population is now under net zero targets, and I think obviously as the sort of the world economies look to stimulate post the COVID pandemic, we're seeing a lot of green stimulus and huge amounts of investment. And I think it's worth bearing in mind the scale of the transformation is going to be pretty huge when we look across our energy systems, our transport systems, our high intensity emitting industries. The scale of the transformation is significant. I guess one of the reasons I'm here today is that South Australia is I suppose regarded as a bit of a window to the future for energy system transformation. Obviously, systems around the world are transforming. I think we seem to find ourselves a little bit further down the path than many areas. And I guess just to sort of put a bit of some numbers around that or some facts, I guess South Australia has gone from less than 1% renewables 15 years ago to approaching 70% renewables in terms of the amount of electricity generated in the state. We expect to reach 100% net renewables by 2030, and we do have a vision for more of a 500% renewable sort of target or 500% renewable vision by 2050. I guess that South Australia, from an electricity perspective, has really gone from a coal and gas generation mix through to a wind, solar and gas generation mix. So we've never had any large-scale hydro, no nuclear, and since 2016, no coal. We've got one of the highest rooftop solar PV penetrations in the world. It's our single largest generator in the state now, is the amount of rooftop solar PV on homes of roofs and businesses around the country. And I guess what we're starting to see now is, we've been a pioneer in big batteries. Obviously, the very famous sort of Tesla big battery that held the world record for the world's largest battery for 2.5 years, which is pretty remarkable in a fast-moving sort of environment. We've got really strong uptake of home batteries and a very vibrant VPP market. We're really pushing hard on hydrogen. We're home to Australia's largest electrolyser, and we have competitive advantages in both blue and green hydrogen production. We're also really, whilst Australia is lagging in terms of electric vehicles, we are trying to get the market or get the environment ready. So we are starting to roll out statewide recharging network. and looking at how we can ensure that vehicles, when they do charge in South Australia's electricity system, are charging when it's sunny and windy, whether it's at home or at the workplace, on the highway, overnight, at a hotel or motel, or wherever the cars may be being charged. And I guess we're also seeing various innovations in microgrids, demand management, bioenergy, and the like. So a lot happening in our market. I guess pleasingly, we're starting to see emissions are down. The state has a net zero by 2050 target and looking at 50% emission reduction by 2030. Wholesale electricity prices have really come down over the last 18 months. And so really, I guess strategically for us as a state that is rich in renewables, we're now turning our mind to how do we attract new energy intensive industries to the state that can kind of capitalise on this sort of abundant, low cost renewable energy and clean hydrogen. And I guess particularly, I am part of the Department for Energy Mining. So South Australia has a raft of mineral resources that are already being mined and exported with a lot of Australia's copper, magnetite, graphite, a whole range of resources. So we are particularly interested in how can we leverage the state's competitive advantages in clean energy to value add those particular commodities and start to look at downstream manufacturing opportunities. So hopefully that's a useful scene setter for the discussion to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, a lot of the discussions around decarbonization note that it's going to actually require a significant amount of additional production of key green metals such as copper, cobalt, lithium. So I guess looking first at this supply issue, how is the industry going to bring the supply up of these key energy metals to a point where we need them to be able to support this sort of energy transition that globally we're looking at? And I guess a follow-up question to that is, do you think current levels of investment are high enough to support this as well? So I'm not sure if maybe Bert wants to kick us off there.
Sure. Many thanks for that, Amy. Well, that's a great question. I mean, I honestly have to say, knowing how the supply stack looks like globally for most of these metals and minerals, and knowing what the technical and financing hurdles are to make a large mining project happen in the real world, in quite a significant number of metals and minerals, I cannot see where the necessary supply response is going to come from for energy transition. Unfortunately, I mean, you take, for example, copper as an example, right? So in the most conservative growth forecast globally for electric vehicles and for renewable energy penetration to be on track for the Paris goals, you need 30% more annual copper production than you have now within the decade. So that's between 5 and 6 million tons annually, right? Incremental production by 2030. That's the equivalent of 5 times Escondida. So Escondida is the world's largest copper mine. Its grades are declining. Yeah. The last time that on the whole planet a sizable new copper deposit has been discovered was 13 years ago, Kamoa in the DRC, and that would have 500,000 tons of production. So the first of all is I'm not sure where the primary supply is going to come from. It's easy to say that recycling can fill the gap, but only a very small percentage of copper is recycled globally for the simple reason that it finds itself intermingled with lots of other metals and minerals in billions of small electric devices. It might technically not be possible to meaningfully increase the recycling quota in copper. So long story short, the raw material, and I've just used copper as an example, and lithium is maybe more dramatic because you need obviously almost a threefold increase in supply within the decade. The response, obviously, from a risk capital point of view in mining, that is good news, because it means that long-term the prices would probably settle on much higher equilibrium prices, which then also means, however, that the cost of electric vehicles and the cost of renewable energy is going up, right? If the input factors all cost much more. From an energy transition point of view, this is going to be challenging because it really looks like, if you look with the eye of realism at the data, and at the supply stack, it's really not clear where it's going to come from. Of course, you can develop then lots of lower grade deposits and marginal deposits, but then the cost of production and also the metal prices will increase very materially, right? Then and it's not just copper. We're talking lithium, we're talking nickel, we're talking tin, we're talking rare earth. We're talking about a lot of different metals that are required here. Also, a lot of people don't want to hear it, but there has to be a discussion about metallurgical coal as well, right? Because at the moment you have per megawatt of installed wind energy, you need between 70 and 90 tons of metallurgical coal to put that in place. And for solar energy, it's 10 times higher. So per megawatt of installed solar energy, you need between 700 and 800 tons of metallurgical coal. And that is because the steel structures underpinning all this renewable energy, they require metallurgical coal. The jury is still out if electric arc furnaces or hydrogen-produced steels actually can deliver the steel quality that is required for a lot of heavy-duty steels without actually blending metallurgical coal in the mix. There's different views on that. We have certainly heard a number of steel industry participants make the statement that hydrogen-produced steels and electric arc furnaces may not be able to deliver the steel qualities that you require for a lot of heavy-duty steels. So this is all a very, I don't know personally if that's correct or not, but that's what I've certainly heard from a number of people in the steel industry. So all I'm saying is this is a very complex topic, and it's actually interesting that a lot of people who actually propose energy, who actually are very, very strongly promoting energy transition, at the same time actually oppose metals and mining or extractive industries overall. And there needs to be a debate that actually cannot have one without the other. You will not be able to have energy transition without a material long-term increase in primary mining. So there's a missing link here, frankly speaking, in the public debate. Now, what we as a financier can do is, and that's what we're doing anyway, we focus our investment strategy on those metals and minerals that are critical for energy transition, and that there's lots of them. I mean, rare earth, you need a fourfold increase in supply over the next 20 years. Tin, you want to make sure it's all going to come from reputable sources, Western mines, and not from artisanal production. So that's just there's a really big issue of supply coming.
Do any of our other panelists want to follow up on that?
I will expand on a couple of things. I'm more of an energy person and less of a metals person. I cover about 16 commodities in Noble, but my career has been a lot in energy. I have many thoughts on the topic of I'm more thinking about downstream, not so much thinking about decarbonizing the upstream. To me, the elephant in the room is the downstream, really. And particularly, you have to think China and India. We have, I mean, for some of you guys, it would probably be good news to hear that China this year, particularly, they have been quite in an energy squeeze. They found themselves quite short of energy. And what they are managing to do, and these are very recent numbers, they are at the moment growing renewables about 20% year on year on generation. For a 10-year period, they managed to reach 30 terawatt hour. So, I mean, that's good news because China was not growing at 20%. China, if anything, has been very slow to implement renewables in the grid. I would say the country that has led efforts in Asia has probably been Korea. I would say it tends to have the higher rate of implementation of renewables with growth about 15% consistently for 5 years, I think. In the last 5 years per annum, so 15% per annum. So I would say probably where we are seeing the sentiment in terms of power, where we are seeing the highest willingness to really, drive change has been in Korea. Basically, people talk about Japan, but if you look at the rates of growth and really the actions, not the promises or the plans or anything, really the one that is implementing the fastest is Korea. Now, there is a big problem in Asia. If you think about it like this, if you think about the most efficient, let's call it, and this is actually quite debatable, and you are welcome to fight me or anything you want, but the most efficient grid really is the European. So if you look at the way the Europeans have managed to transition, it's got a lot of elements. It's not the one-stop shop or anything. It's just bits and pieces through many pieces of the chain along the chain, right? So what I mean, one, and this is, I'm sorry, it's not a metal, but it's a commodity, and I'm gonna talk about it. Carbon, right? So carbon, it's a massive problem. You have to offset carbon. So you can decarbonize in the process, for example, in steel, you can try to decarbonize the grid, and you can try to green, things on that side. But you will also need to be able to have carbon offsets. You need a price signal for carbon. There is no price signal, not real price signal for carbon in Asia. So for example, my friend has, Mr. Pasos has an exchange for carbon in Singapore, and you can go in there and you can have a blockchain-based transfer of credits, but they are voluntary credits, and they're about $2. And you know where the European market is, right? North of 50 euros. So, you have a massive disconnect on the price signal that we are giving to markets on $70 in Europe, about 70 US, and $2 in Asia, and it's voluntary. And there is, that's a problem. That's a big problem, right? How can you have that? And then when you talk to BP and the guys that do all the net zero exercises and, think about how decarbonizing power, and the people that are way smarter than I am, their price signal for year 2040, they say, this was shocking to me. I discovered this recently. The price signal needs to be $175 per ton of carbon. And we are nowhere. We're not even thinking about that. Like people are paying $2 per ton of carbon for doing forestry projects in Indonesia. So that's a problem. The other problem is a political issue and comparing the what I would call the inefficiencies of the Asia power systems, comparing them to Europe. Europe is all interconnected. So in Europe, if you have a lot of wind in Germany, France can benefit from that if Germany doesn't take it, right? So the interconnectivity of the grid in Europe creates a lot of efficiencies that are needed to be able to handle the fluctuations on the output of renewables. So in the case of Australia, you guys have decided to do batteries, for example, but you guys don't have many choices, but really it's unthinkable that you have an interconnected Japan, Korea, China grid, right? So, but that the reality is you should have that. So that's one of the topics I find fascinating. How do you manage the base load? And later, I hope we talk about nuclear power a little bit. How do you manage the base load? How do you make the system more efficient, more interconnected? And I guess this is gonna go to Bert's point on copper, that you basically you have to have better connectivity in order to really be efficient in decarbonizing power in particular. And then you have to have a proper price for carbon. I'll shut up now. Sorry, I went on too long, but I'll let you talk. And yeah, if anybody wants to raise an issue on this, we can continue to discuss that.
Sounds great. And Richard, I don't know if you want to follow up on some of the stuff that Bert and Rodrigo have mentioned.
Well, I guess perhaps just at Rodrigo's sort of latter points, we're certainly seeing across Australia the trend is towards power systems that are really predominantly solar and wind, so renewables supported by batteries and supported by gas. As I said, South Australia is sort of the coal generation exited in 2016. A lot of the other Australian states are still very heavily reliant on coal generation, but there's changes expected. But we are also, I mean, we do suffer being a very large country with a relatively small population in global terms, and that does make interconnectivity challenging, although there was a decision earlier this week that an interconnector will basically has reached financial close to build a new interconnector between South Australia and New South Wales. At the moment, South Australia has got just a single main interconnector to Victoria. Victoria is interconnected to New South Wales, but this will kind of create the triangle. So we are starting to see some of those, or the recognition of the need for increased interconnection.
And I guess before we move on, we have a question from the audience directed to Bert, asking if your copper demand figures are based on current design of EVs, or does it take into account potential EV design innovations, which could cut down the amount of copper wiring required in an EV?
I think they're based on current. They're based on current design. So how we arrive at our figures, we essentially take the forecasts that are out there in the market, right, and take a look at the metal intensity. Yeah. But honestly, even if I mean, an electric vehicle requires 5 to 6 times more copper than an internal combustion engine vehicle, right? So even if you cut that in half, together with all the copper wiring that you need in the renewable energy, and in the charging infrastructure, even then you still look at a scenario where essentially you need either much higher prices to incentivize all the many low-grade deposits that are out there to come on, right? Or you have a real supply shortage. So because don't forget, I mean, we based our numbers on the most conservative forecast out there, and frankly speaking, the current trajectory that you're seeing actually points towards a more aggressive adoption of electric vehicles, right, and renewable energy. So it may well be that if you have some metal savings because of innovation, that you still have a massive shortage, because for all intents and purposes, it looks like actually the electric vehicle penetration rates are going to be quite higher than the ones that actually underpin our own estimates. And again, I say it's not only copper. Yeah? I mean, I've just used copper as an example because it's a good one. Yeah. But you have the problem across the whole metals and mineral complex, like everything from nickel to lithium to tin to rare earth element, etc., etc., etc. So it's not just a one metal problem; it's a multi-metal problem.
Okay, and actually, another kind of relevant question has just come in. I think we can ask before we move on. So Rodrigo mentioned the issue of baseload power, and separately the issue of nuclear. Is there a place in the Australian future energy mix for the developing micro-nuclear technologies, such as molten salt generators, provided the legislation can be amended to accept these non-traditional nuclear technologies? So maybe Rodrigo or...
Sounds to me like that question is going to the Australians.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Look, certainly, look, what I can say, local, as it's been acknowledged, we would require legislative change in Australia to enable a nuclear generation industry. It has been looked at in the past. There was a Royal Commission in South Australia a number of years ago into opportunities in the nuclear fuel cycles. South Australia is a major exporter of uranium. But we don't really use uranium at all. So we were looking at what are the opportunities in either enrichment, power generation, or waste management. So and really, I think the commission concluded there was probably a major opportunity in waste management, but not so much in power generation and in enrichment for South Australia. There was a public debate, and it wasn't really supported at the public level. But I think what we've certainly seen is, wind and solar are now the cheapest forms of generation. So if you're in a part of the world where there's very strong wind and solar resources and lots of land, i.e. Australia, they are the technologies that are coming into the market first. And the power systems are really moving around those forms of generation. So as I said, we very much, when it's windy, the wind comes into the market. When it's sunny, the sun comes into the market. The batteries help with the smoothing the frequency, and then the gas does the rest of the lifting when it's not sunny and windy. And so there's an increasing trend towards fast gas-fired power generation. And I would say, and looking over the horizon, increasing interest in gas turbines that can be powered by hydrogen as well. So that's sort of probably the next frontier that we're starting to see. So I think in that context, and as I said, the fact that Australia doesn't have a nuclear industry, and it would take, various commentators have said, decade or more to develop that capability in Australia. I don't see a particular strong appetite towards nuclear generation in the next decade or two.
I'm not sure if any of our other panelists have any insight into kind of uranium or past, outside of Australia.
It's probably necessary to achieve net zero globally, because let's not forget, in a lot of the world, you don't have the renewable energy abilities that you have in Australia. And as Richard says, Australia is very thinly populated, so you can build large wind and large solar farms in a lot of places, right? Of course, there's another debate here, and again, I don't want to sidetrack the discussion, but this is almost also a debate kind of where do you actually incur CO2 emissions, right? Because the solar panels and EV batteries and other batteries have to be produced, right? I mean, the other day I participated in a conference about the lithium supply chain, where it was actually interesting to actually see what the CO2 emissions are of all the stationary batteries that are being used globally for renewable energy and for electric vehicles, right? And where those are produced. And actually, it turns out that the majority of these batteries are being produced actually with coal-fired power plants, with energy from coal-fired power. So it's quite nice if you have, for example, in Germany or in Australia, people having an EV battery in an electric car, but then that battery has been produced somewhere with coal-fired power and then being shipped around half the world with a CO2 emitting freightliner just to put into somebody's electric vehicle, and people then feel good because they charge it from the grid. But in reality, a lot of CO2, a very heavy CO2 footprint has already been established by just producing and transporting that battery and that vehicle. So that's a discussion for another day.
On the topic of conventional nuclear power, so I'm talking uranium, I was doing, other people might have better numbers than I do, but I was trying to update a bit yesterday, working on trying to figure out what Asia is likely to be installing over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of capacity. And what I'm able to find here, I have a problem with China because the 14th five-year plan is not very clear on the target. It used to be quite clear, but it's about 50 gigawatts that you would get somewhere between 2025 and, being commissioned between 2025 and 2030. That would be Japan, Korea, China, India, and I think Taiwan. So, that's sizable globally. Additionally, you have extensions to life of nuclear plants, because I think it's undeniable that we also need nuclear in order to decarbonize. I see it that way. I think we need a bit of everything. I actually think the backlash against gas is nonsensical, because gas is a very good means to achieve our transitional fuel to achieve lower carbon, right? So people get really radical and want to go from something to nothing without any steps in between, and gas actually helps with that. But coming back to nuclear, you really need base power. You really do. Whether you do it with batteries, but definitely nuclear helps in a grid, and if anything, Asia needs more nuclear. If you look at now, you look at the supply of uranium. Bert might know way more about this than I do, but if you look at it over the next 10 years, you get a fairly sizable shortage of uranium availability because you haven't had any investment in, basically the uranium space was supposed to die, and you haven't had enough investment, and you have depletion of reserves, and Olympic Dam is not expanding, and Cigar Lake is running out of reserves, and so you have a global declining supply curve of uranium, and you have a very real need for the nuclear power in a lot of the grids, especially in growing economies in Asia. So I don't know. I'll let you guys pick on that if you agree or disagree. Doesn't matter, just for discussion.
Not sure if any of our other panelists want to touch on uranium, or if we should move on to the next topic. Okay, I think we can move on to look at hydrogen, which seems to be one of the big topics of today. So not sure if any of our panelists have insight into kind of who is most advanced on delivering cheap hydrogen refueling solution for passenger vehicles. Are you aware of any technical or commercial developments or breakthroughs to help reduce or bypass the cost of storing hydrogen? And also maybe just some insight into, what's happening in the hydrogen space. How do we get to that green hydrogen, which will really help with this whole energy transition?
Well, you need lots of renewable energy for it. And again, my concern is that the raw material base to establish the global wind and solar footprint does not exist.
I can potentially jump in here, Amy. It's hydrogen, something that sort of we've been looking at here for about 5 years. We've produced a roadmap. We've done various studies. We've produced an action plan. We've funded projects, and we've been engaging pretty closely with other nations around the world that are looking at hydrogen. I think there's a lot of, if you look at the various nations with national roadmaps or strategies around hydrogen, obviously Japan, South Korea, Germany, UK, Europe are real clear leaders in the hydrogen space. I think hydrogen's obviously sort of shown a lot of promise over decades. So a lot of people ask, well, why do we think hydrogen's time has now come? I think it's the combination of the falling cost or maturity of hydrogen consuming technologies. So at the moment, we're mainly looking at fuel cells that can turn hydrogen, mix hydrogen with the air to recreate electricity. So they're being used obviously to do stationary power, sort of uninterruptible power supplies. We're starting to see fuel cell forklifts, fuel cell passenger vehicles. To some extent, most of the thinking seems to be that hydrogen powered vehicles, the competitive advantage is in heavy mobility, where batteries aren't going to be particularly viable. So particularly, heavy duty, long distance trucking, for example. We're also starting, as I mentioned before, to see advancements in gas turbines that can use hydrogen as a fuel. And I think there's a lot of interesting research coming out of Japan in using ammonia. So you need hydrogen to make ammonia. And there's a lot of research around direct use of ammonia as a fuel. So I think last week, JERA released an indication that it wants to co-fire ammonia in a coal-fired power station in Japan and do a trial in, I think, 2023 or 2024. There's also a lot of interest globally in using ammonia as a shipping fuel, as a zero carbon shipping fuel. And we're starting to see advancements in ammonia fuel cells and ammonia turbines as well. So I think, growing amount of interest in hydrogen. Of course, not only can it be used to decarbonise transport and power generation, but also heavy industry. So I know obviously there's I think still a bit of technological maturity to go in terms of the green steel development, as Bert touched on before, but certainly seeing lots of opportunities there. I think there's different countries are looking at green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. So With blue hydrogen, you can produce it either from the gasification of coal and capture the carbon and sequester it, or you can reform natural gas and again capture the carbon and sequester it. Or of course, with renewable hydrogen, the main technology is electrolysis, which involves splitting of water using large amounts of renewable electricity. We're seeing various, particularly perhaps in the Australian context, a huge amount of momentum around hydrogen. There's every state and territory either has or is developing a hydrogen strategy. There is a national hydrogen strategy which has been agreed by all states and territories and the Commonwealth government. And there's a huge groundswell of projects being developed in Australia. We've got one locally, which is a green hydrogen project, which is a demonstration project for production of green hydrogen and blending into the natural gas network. So that is currently Australia's largest electrolyser, but there's some very, very large projects on the drawing board, with probably the biggest one being a 26 gigawatt renewable project with around 13 gigawatts worth of electrolysers in the northwest of Australia. So we are seeing, at least at the design phase, some very, very large green hydrogen projects.
Great. Just as a quick follow-up, we have a question from the audience asking, is there a sustainable supply of water for green hydrogen, considering the population growth and agricultural demand?
So certainly most of the projects we're seeing are sort of basically desalination is in their base case for the water supply. Most of the economics of green hydrogen, at least, are driven by the cost of electricity and the utilisation rate of the electrolysers. The cost of water is a very, very small amount of the total price stack. So if you like, the penalty you pay for desalinated water has very little impact on the end price of the hydrogen.
Great. And actually, if anyone in the audience has any further questions specifically around hydrogen, we will be doing a presentation and a Q&A in 2 weeks' time with somebody from Cicero on this. So if anyone has further questions on hydrogen, they can send me an email and we can make sure that we post them to that person, and we'll have that Q&A released in a few weeks. So I guess moving on, we have a few more questions from the audience, but I wanted to quickly touch on thermal coal and see, kind of where is this heading over the next few years? What do you think the future is here in terms of pricing and demand? And how is that really going to come out of this discussion? Nobody wants to touch that.
Well, we don't invest in thermal coal, so I can't really kind of claim real in-depth knowledge here.
Yeah, I've been looking at thermal coal for 20 years across 3 different continents, so I'll have a go. In reality, I would say that rumors of the death of coal have been greatly exaggerated. What you would assume from what you hear that international market is about 1 billion tons. You would assume that you have a declining trend on that. I'm not pro coal or anything. I'm agnostic. But the reality is that the market for thermal coal is not declining yet. This year, actually, we are seeing fairly strong demand from China and India. I mean, as much as we all want to transition and everything, the demand for coal, the pipeline of new projects maybe will be tapering down later in this decade. But the existing footprint globally, particularly in Asia, of thermal coal capacity, it's just too large to have a dramatic decline, right? So I think we talk about peak coal. It hasn't happened. It could probably happen in year 2024, I think, possibly. I mean, you have to include China in that equation. I mean, I find it very funny that people like to talk about, you know, coal-fired power stations in Europe and the US and demonize them, right? While I mean, there has been the adoption of thermal coal-fired power in Asia has been so strong, right? So unfortunately, let's say, we probably have we haven't peaked, and we'll probably be looking at a decline rate of about maybe after 2024 or so. Difficult to call a peak, by the way. But the decline would be probably about, in terms of demand for coal, after that point, probably 2 to 3% per annum. So if you start thinking about it and extrapolating what that does, you don't really have a significant decline in the demand for thermal coal really until probably the end of the 30s, I think. So, I mean, those are my main thoughts. And then you have the ESG backfire. So, for example, BERT doesn't want to, well, I mean, BERT policy, that they don't invest in thermal coal. But then the reality is that the power station hasn't disappeared. And as much as we all want to you know, to transition to something else, the market's still there. So what happens is, if you don't fund the supply, then what you have is I mean, you have a price signal that will take care of that, right? So it is possible that the death of coal, well, one is what I was saying is going to be slow. And the second one is that there is a possibility that the death of coal happens in a high price environment in the long run. And it's similar to the case of what you could see in oil and gas also. So there are unintended consequences of ESG in all of this, I think.
Okay. It's moving back on to questions that have been coming in from the audience. I'm not sure if anyone is able to comment on what are the applications of PGEs in clean fuel technology? And is it only fuel cells or also directly in electric cars?
It's primarily in fuel cells. So that would be good news for the platinum and palladium industry. A broad penetration of fuel cells, right? But for that, in order for that to translate into investment decisions, one would need to have much more visibility, right? Whether a fuel cell market is actually indeed going to take off or not, right? Which is not really predictable as of today. But yeah, that would be the prime catalyst for demand growth in PGEs, fuel cells.
We are kind of nearing the end of this, but we can maybe take another question or so. But we wanted to touch on ESG, and we've had questions coming in looking at how do you think the focus of ESG investing has helped the industry, and what sort of discussions do we need to be having to continue to move forward towards global decarbonization? We talked a little bit about kind of closing that, you know, the communication gap that exists between how much mining needs to happen versus people that are maybe reticent about actually kind of.
That's a big topic. That's a big topic, Amy, because we are aware of lots of large institutional investor pools who do not invest in the extractive industry, period, for ESG reasons, right? But the very same investors would absolutely finance the construction of large-scale wind farms and solar farms and EV factories, et cetera, right? And there's a kind of, I would say almost an institutionalized refusal to acknowledge that you cannot have one without the other. Now, and that risks becoming a self-goal, because if you do not finance the extractive industry, then the resulting raw material shortage will mean that the prices for renewable energy and electric vehicle are going to go up so much that they again are not becoming cost competitive, thus creating an obstacle to actually their further more broader allocation, right? Or to the growth in renewable energy and electric vehicles, right? So actually an ideologically driven, ESG ideological driven refusal to invest in mining will ultimately endanger or most likely make it impossible to actually meet the goals under the Paris Agreement, because you will not be able to produce enough electric vehicles and to put in place enough renewable energy. So for me personally, that's the biggest disconnect. The second biggest disconnect is also the refusal to acknowledge there are certain items, there are nuances that are important, right? So again, I'm using metallurgical coal as an example. Metallurgical coal is not the same as metallurgical coal. So there's, for example, coals that have very low scope 1 and 2 emissions, right? Because they're produced open cut and not underground, because they're produced with state-of-the-art technology, because they have very strong properties in the blast furnace. And there are other metallurgical coals that have 4 times, 5 times higher scope 1 and 2 emissions, right? So you may well find, and again, I'm speculating here, you may well find if you run a blast furnace exclusively with kind of low CO2 coals, with low scope 1 and 2 emissions, right? That might actually have a similar CO2 footprint than if you have a hydrogen furnace where you put large renewable energy installations in place, right? And because those need to be built, and those are also very raw material intensive, right? So there is lots of nuances here that never find their way into the political or into the public debate. And I think I think the most important thing is that it's actually kind of everybody bases the conversation on the same facts and actually on realistic facts, rather than just being purely ideologically driven.
And do any of our other panelists want to follow up on that, just kind of as a closing statement on kind of where you see things headed, how ESG is playing in to kind of help enable this energy transition?
I guess as a general comment, we certainly see a lot of interest from investors in investing in a whole raft of different projects. I sort of see the bottleneck is probably on bankable projects, and that's irrespective of what sort of sector they're in. I certainly agree with Bert. I mean, an electric vehicle battery, lithium-ion batteries are chock full of metals. You know, it's very metals intensive, and so the reality is that yes, we do need a whole raft of materials to support this energy transition. I guess obviously we sort of see that as a great opportunity for South Australia. You know, that sort of overlay of the renewable energy as well as those mineral resources. So we already do have a number of smelters in the state, and we are looking at what are the other sort of value adding and opportunities where we can really leverage the competitive advantages the state has got in low cost energy and minerals, and really with that longer term vision of being able to produce some of these green metals that will be demanded going forward. But there is obviously, as Bert knows, there's questions of scale and what you know the size of the demand globally is going to be very large.
And Rodrigo, any final kind of closing thoughts on that?
I mean, ESG is a bit of a double-edged sword, and the thinking that has to go into it cannot be the linear thinking that we are currently applying. It has to be a bit of a more comprehensive and better thought approach. It's not just block miners, they are evil and we don't need this stuff. You will pay the consequence of policy mistakes on that front. So, I mean, I'm not against it, but I think the current state of affairs for ESG is not where we should be.
And so we haven't been able to get to all of the questions that came in. Actually, I think let's answer this one last one, and then I think we can call it a day. So there, somebody asked, there appears to be a basic media logic that goes like this: coal is bad, coal is mined, therefore mining is bad. And this seriously reduces the community acceptance of mining for the materials for green energy and decarbonization. Will anyone weigh into the question of how industry and community address this flawed logic? So I think that's a really kind of good place for everyone to maybe share their thoughts before we close off for today.
First of all, I totally agree with whoever sent that comment that tarnishes the overall reputation. I mean, yeah, look, the mining industry needs to do a better PR job, and politicians also just need to basically kind of tell the electorate what the genuine state of affairs is, rather than jump on a bandwagon and just kind of say an opinion what they think is a kind of the ideologically most convenient message to tell the population.
Anyone else?
Agree and agree.
Okay.
Because the consumer will pay for the consequence of there not being sufficient raw materials.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if it's the electricity consumer or the buyer of a smartphone or the buyer of an electric vehicle. If there's not sufficient raw materials, the prices of all of that are going to go up materially.
I think it's forums like these, we actually get the responsibility gets passed on to us to do the educational part of this, right? So I don't know what else we can do, but try to educate people on what they are really doing when you suppress a particular side of a supply chain, right? It's not something that it's very intuitive. It's complex stuff, and people need to be educated. I keep educating myself, by the way. I mean, it's a really complex topic, and all we can do, I guess, is try to tell people, what we find.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, that's I think a very nice place to end, and I want to thank all of our panelists for taking part today. And we hope everybody enjoyed this forum, and we hope to see everyone again at an in-person event, hopefully soon. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Amy.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.